All set?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Senate Education, and today, Tuesday, we're going to be talking about two main issues, possible statutory language in each case, things that have bubbled up and been discussed at certain levels in the Senate, certain levels in the House, certain levels of stakeholders. And the first is Act 173 delay. If committee members will cast their minds back to when we were actually physically in the State House, we had a meeting about an unrelated topic, and Jeff Fannin for NEA proposed that we repeal Act 173, which we quickly as a committee said that we weren't interested in doing, but the conversation turned logically to whether Act 173 should be delayed. And that's where this conversation for the opening segment began. So I've asked Jeff and Secretary French here. Secretary French, thank you for the AOE basis document, which is on our committee page. That lays out the position of AOE, but I assume you can summarize it for us. Would you like to begin by doing that?
Sure. Good afternoon. As Senator Ruth was saying, as we were pre-COVID-19, we were working with the Census-Based Advisory Group and the State Board and so forth to try to this year come to some consensus on advocating for changes to 173. As you know, the technical corrections were not passed last year. And we were trying to do that together as a group this year, so you'd hear one voice as much as possible on that issue. And then COVID-19 happened. So we're certainly inclined to support a delay across the board, largely due to the effects of COVID-19, but with the caveat that we haven't had a chance to consult with the Census-Based Advisory Group or the State Board yet on that issue. I suspect they'd be supportive of that, but as laid out in our position, we support across the board, essentially a one-year delay in its implementation.
And if I'm right, Secretary, you, in that document, you were asking essentially for us to wait until May when the State Board could meet?
Well, I don't know if that's possible or not. The State Board will meet April 22nd, I believe. We have John and I have a pre-agenda planning meeting scheduled for Thursday of this week. I assume we're going to hold that meeting. His inclination, I'm sure, will be to hold that meeting as scheduled. But we just wanted to alert you to the fact that as much as we were desiring to do this on a consensus basis this year, meaning coming to you with a uniform recommendation, we're essentially unable to do that for a number of reasons, one of which is COVID-19.
Yep. Okay. I think it would be great if the State Board could maybe, and the advisory group could maybe expedite their, not necessarily call a separate meeting, but maybe they could get a sense of where they are, because if there's general agreement, waiting, another month or a month and a half might not be the best course of action. So maybe we can speed that up. But would you like to add anything else? I know I wanted to ask you specifically because last year when we wrote delay language, your testimony, obviously pre-COVID-19, was that it would cost the state a certain amount in potential savings. Is that sort of estimate playing any part in your thinking now about delay?
Yeah, I would say in this year, once again, COVID-19 figuring prominently in our logic, we didn't go to those other layers of analysis. It's really, I think, really almost impossible to project the financial implications at this point. As much as we could say, if holding everything else the same, we could draw some assumptions, but I don't think it's prudent to draw any assumptions being the same, because clearly COVID-19 is going to have a pretty profound impact on education finance. So I think, our perspective this year is largely influenced by an assessment of the agency's capacity, but also the capacity of the field to implement this complex policy with fidelity, while at the same time we are engaged in sort of fundamental review and implementation of the education system during and after COVID-19.
Committee, questions for the secretary about this issue? If not, then I'll turn to Jeff Fannin. Jeff, you heard me say maybe at the beginning that in my mind, it was really your comments in one of our meetings that started this train of thought. Obviously, with COVID-19, the changes in delivery culture for special education services have been backburnered as we try to do just normal special education services and instruction. But I don't want to speak for you. I would assume you would be in favor of this delay, but what is NEA's position?
So first off, thank you for having me, Jeff Fannin from Vermont NEA, for the record. So our original position on Act 173 pre-COVID, albeit, was that the rollout was problematic, and that the advisory group had focused exclusively on the funding component of it, when in fact the law was about changing practice. It was about changing how educators delivered special ed services to kids. And we were firm in our belief that unless and until you get to changing the practice, and that's why the law originally had a 4-year phase-in period, that unless and until you got to a point where you were actually working with educators over the long term to really change how they delivered their services to the kids on special needs, IEPs, that you couldn't get the funding, right? We were putting the cart before the horse. And so our point was, let's change, hit repeal, give time for folks to get to change practice. Really what the law was asking was changing culture. And that does not come easy, as we all know. So we were saying, hit repeal. Then we're not saying don't work towards it, but work to change the culture, and then hit the funding stream, triggers, if you will. So now here we are, COVID, in a COVID world, and we're learning that special education has become a bigger and bigger issue, because, and as the Disability Law Project at Legal Aid has talked about, the challenges of providing services to kids in this environment. So it's even more problematic now to change the practice in this immediate environment. So certainly repeal is an option. Indefinite delay, we are in support of, and certainly we shouldn't be changing more things right now on top of a system that's already incredibly stressed. And my members I'm hearing from teachers and support staff around the state of the efforts they're putting in above and beyond to try to reach kids at all who don't have access to internet, and then try to provide any kind of services or educational component in an environment where half the kids or so don't have internet, are fighting with internet. I'm in my office today because, frankly, I have 2 kids at home are doing online learning, and there's not enough bandwidth at my house, literally. So I'm case in point as to why we need to be careful about how we do this online learning stuff, and certainly all the more important with special needs kids who have real challenges that we need to address. So we're still firm in the repeal, or if you want to call it indefinite delay. We think it's important to give the field time, particularly now, to get its sea legs under them, and before we move ahead.
So I don't want to speak for you, but let me rephrase what you're saying. So I assume you would support a 1-year delay. It's just that's a little too definite. You would prefer something that was open-ended in terms of delay. But is it fair to say that NEA would support a year delay?
Well, certainly at a minimum. And here's what I'll say to that, Senator, is that what we're starting to hear things. We're talking about waiving statewide testing this year, but we're also asking and inquiring about whether it makes sense today or sooner rather than later to waive statewide testing for next year. Because we're all across the nation, we know kids are going to suffer a gap. You know, what is the point of putting them through an exam when we already can tell right now that next year they'll suffer a gap if we just use the same test? Or do we rewrite all the tests to take into account the delay in any education or deficiencies that we're encountering now? So looking ahead, if you just do a 1-year delay, we're already thinking 2 years for a lot of the corona issues that we know are coming down the road. So I think it makes sense to delay even longer, to give people some time to actually find out what they're dealing with next year. I mean, let's assume for a minute we start September 1, and I know we're all hopeful of that. We think there are going to be significant educational gaps, mental health and socioeconomic gaps that will really be exposed when these kids come back, when students come back to their classrooms in September. And I think there's going to be a lot of remedial work that needs to be done statewide, whether it's in some places we do more than others, but certainly special ed might be a significant portion of it. So I think at least a 2-year delay at a minimum makes sense to give everybody time to get their feet back under them and then figure out where they go from there in defining how to change the culture that Act 173 was trying to do.
Well,
I don't oppose the 1-year delay, but I think it's deficient.
okay, let me reserve my opinion, and obviously the committee hasn't considered this yet, but Secretary, could I ask you to just respond to that if you want to?
No, I think, Jess makes some good points. And I think it's hard for me to engage more deeply in that. COVID-19 is just the prevailing lens right now for so much of what we're looking at. So we haven't heard anything more from the federal government in terms of waivers for next year on assessment. So I think it's premature to contemplate that. I would point out the research and the UVM study, in particular behind 173, points to the necessity of addressing the financial implications first. I mean, the entire logic essentially of the report is that we've made attempts at changing culture through MTSS and so forth for many years, in some cases 20 years. The policies that have been contemplated in 173 have been in existence that long. But what they found in their research was that the financial incentives are wrong. It's actually, the financial incentives do not promote good practice. And there's actually a disconnect between the financial structure that we currently have, the reimbursement model, and getting practices to actually be implemented. So I think a case can be made based on that research to suggest that the absent implementation of the change in the financial model to a block grant, we are not going to see the desired changes in practice. But once again, I think the primary concern right now is really COVID-19. And to Jeff's point, there's tremendous stress on the system right now. But the implications of COVID-19, I think, are going to be significant for our country and for our state in terms of how we educate students. So I want to preserve as much flexibility for the system to recover and make sense of this, with a priority being, as Jeff mentioned, on recovering student learning and getting it back on track, and making sure our staff feel supported and are able to do the essential work that society requires of them.
The other couple of, a few more things to throw into the hat. One is that a year delay doesn't preclude a 2-year delay. It just says we would come back at it next year with more data and with a better handle on the situation. The other thing is that I'm sure in people's other committees, you're dealing with this, the idea that we want to be legislating at this moment for the emergency and not beyond. So in judiciary, for instance, there were some provisions that would help in the emergency, but the judiciary or corrections wanted them to stretch out permanently. And it's that permanent status or the the status beyond the emergency that creates the disagreements. People can tend to agree what to do now, but then they disagree about what should be happening next year. So I think, speaking for myself, my inclination is if we delay, a 1-year delay, with the idea that we would do a status update next year. Just to, so everybody knows where we are with this, Act 173 changes that the secretary mentioned, those went into the miscellaneous bill 224, which we passed out of committee, which is now in appropriations. They have tentatively pulled out the Act 173 pieces and prepared them to stick in the budget. That was before this discussion of delay happened. But what I would do is have them, if we decide to delay, have them pull those changes out and substitute delay language, for the moment we're in now, rather than just the technical updates that Jim had already prepared. Jim, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I would just say that today in House Education, they took your miscellaneous bill from last year, which was S-164, which they have possession of, and they did a strike all amendment to that bill, putting in 3 topics. One is this topic here, with not an additional year delay because they hadn't heard from Secretary French yet. Second topic is the small school grant to have preschool children not counted.
So that's Bobby Starr language.
And the third area they included is the provisions on the way union school districts fill vacancies. So those are the 3 topics that they have put into their strike all amendment to your bill that they have possession of.
And that was, we got that from Martha Heath originally, I believe.
That language. Yeah, well, sorry, it came from. She supported it. Came from Rep. Jim Batista.
Yes.
Originally, and then another provision came in, very mechanical provision around what happens when you have a union high school district with a member that's a union high school district. How do you run the mechanics of the vote? And that's included too. So so they're moving. They haven't voted. They only were discussing it today, but that's in front of them.
Yep. And Ruth, come to you in 1 second.
Yep.
Just to close that out. So I had been in touch with Representative Webb, and we discussed this path forward. So they would send us back our bill with language pre-agreed. So if we decide to delay and they agree to delay, we can have Jim passing us the language back and forth to make sure both committees are on board. Same ideally would be true of the second item on our agenda for today, if the committee agrees and if the House agrees. But that could well be a single vehicle for all of these 5 or 6 little changes. Not that Act 173 is little to delay it, but Ruth.
Yeah, I just had a question for Jim, just to clarify. Does this bill that you're talking about, I can't remember the number, but the House bill, does it include the technical changes that we had worked on for Act 173 last year that Emily brought to us?
Yeah. So the bill was S-164.
Okay.
Includes the technical changes as well as the timing changes.
Okay, but it does not include yet another 1-year delay.
No, it's just to make the vote work as it now exists.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, if I could, Sue, you were not listed as a witness for Act 173 delay, but do you have any thoughts, any perspective on the school board's view of it? I think you're still muted, Sue.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. The VSBA board is actually meeting tomorrow evening, and this is a topic that I'm going to be bringing up with them. They're going to be discussing several issues that are impacted by COVID-19. So I don't have an official position yet from the VSBA on this topic.
Okay, thank you, Sue.
You're welcome.
Committee, any questions for Secretary French on this, or Jeff Fannin, or Jim? Okay, so I think my sense is that the stakeholder groups are probably going to be united on at least a one-year delay, noting and asterisking Jeff's desire for more than 1 year. So we will, as Secretary French wanted, wait a while to make sure that the state board and the advisory group are also in sync with this. But as the House moves forward, we can be working on language with Jim, and it seems likely that we would pull the trigger at some point down the road on that. So let's shift to the second item on the agenda, which is the default budget language for districts that are unable to produce a budget by July 1st. So just to set the table a little bit, this is language that we developed, that Jim helped Senate Ed develop last year when we were working for Act 46 delay. That didn't wind up being, didn't make it all the way through the building. But the idea was to change existing statute, which now says that after July 1st, districts have the ability to borrow 87% of last year's budget with the associated interest costs. And it would change it to more of a true default, where July 1st, they would get a budget, not borrow money, but get a budget that would count as their education spending for the year. That would be 100% plus an inflator. And there are a number of districts, 18, I believe, that are still in the process of finalizing a budget. So the question for the committee is it preferable to have the language that is up on the committee website? You'll see it says draft bill template, draft 1.1, section 10, school district budgets. So the question is that language necessary and preferable to what exists in statute now? So with that said, let me just ask Jim to kind of walk us through that language. Does everybody have that? Is everybody looking at that?
Well, I think Peggy or Jean can put it up on the screen for you, probably.
I prefer, I don't know how the rest of you feel, I prefer to have it in a window other than the Zoom window, because once they take over the screen with the document, I can't see any of you anymore. So
It's
if that-
posted, Senator.
yeah. So I guess what I would ask is that people bring it up in a window beside their or behind their Zoom screen, as opposed to using that.
Not finding it. Where is it?
It's on the committee website under documents for today.
Yeah, it said it was unable to open.
Oh.
All right, let's try again.
If you can't open it, then we'll have Jeannie put it up on the screen, but
No, it's coming up now. Thanks.
okay, good. So Jim, you want to
Yeah.
quickly walk us through that? It's not long.
Yeah, it's not long. And before I start, just for context, last year, you'll recall that the issue the Act 46 presented was that the 87% ability to borrow language and statute is based on the previous year's budget. And last year, there was no previous year's budget because they were all merging together. So
Right.
that statutory provision didn't apply, and therefore the fix last year, as Senator mentioned, was to create a default budget for the school districts. So the context is a little bit different this year, but the language is quite similar.
Hang on just a second, Jim.
Yeah.
Corey, did you have an issue?
I just want to get on the queue. Jim can finish, but I have a few things I want to raise.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so language, this is draft 1.1, as Senator Ruth mentioned. So I'll just read through it. It's quite short. It says, subsection A says, notwithstanding any provision of law to the contrary, if the fiscal year 2021 budget of a school district has not been approved by voters on or before June 30, 2020, the agency shall authorize an amount of education spending for that, I shouldn't say newly formed, sorry, for that school district equal to the cumulative education spending amount authorized by the 2020 fiscal year school budget, multiplied by an inflator, which is the amount of statewide increase in school district education spending year over year, as reported to the agency on before June 14, 2020. The amount authorized by the agency shall be the education spending of the school district for fiscal year 21 under statute, and the school board has authority within its articles of agreement or in accordance with to determine how to spend that money and may use other funds from other sources as well, such as endowments, etc. That's basically it.
Okay, Corey.
So some of the concerns I have about this whole situation in general is I don't think Vermonters are going to be able to afford the school budgets they just passed a month ago. The economics are very different. And then, so the issue I have here is this inflator language where we're allowing these districts, if they don't have a budget in place by, the end of this fiscal year, that we're going to give them this statewide inflator, which isn't going to help that issue in general. I just, I want to do something so that they're not penalized by July 1st, but I think they're going to be in a similar situation to us, where we're talking a 3-month budget for the state. I think school districts, they don't know if they're going back in September or not. There's a lot of unknowns here. And so I just have concern about that inflator language, because I think we're going to have a discussion in the coming weeks about the budgets that just passed a month ago and can we afford those?
Yep. It's a good point. So the discussion we're having today is to field a number of questions. One is, should we do anything? Because districts now have the ability, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, even if they passed a budget, they could warn another vote with a different budget and have a second vote. So if they decide as a district they can't spend what they okayed under the last vote, they could schedule another vote, although Jim Condos has warned or encouraged communities not to vote in the next couple of months, but they have the power to do it. They also have the ability to use Australian ballot, whether or not they were previously doing that. That's language that we passed just a couple of weeks ago. So one question is, should we do anything? Another is, should it be 100% of last year's budget? Another is, should there be an inflator on that, or should we do something different than those three? So Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Can you hear?
Yep, now I can. No, you muted again. Jim, you muted yourself again. I see them. There you go.
Yeah, okay, good. Sorry. So just one point about the revotes. So it is possible for an approved budget to be reconsidered. There's two ways of doing that. One is by petition by people in the school district. That has to be done within 30 days of the original vote. And that probably, I'm not sure that was done. The other way of doing it is on its own accord, the school board could take action to put. So there's two ways of doing it, but I think now, given where we are, probably only the school board has authority to do the revote.
Yep. Go ahead, Corey, and then Ruth.
What if we, and I don't know if we'll get to this situation, what if we get to the point where we ask as a legislature, ask school boards to come up with new budgets under new guidelines, because I don't think property taxpayers can afford what the bill's going to be sent to them, especially with the shortfall. So I don't know if that's something that is going to be considered or not over the next few weeks, but that's just been populating in my mind.
Well, again, a fair question. I would say as of yet, I haven't heard anybody discussing that idea, but it would only take the governor, let's say, coming out and proposing that, or you know, a major statewide educational organization proposing that. My own thinking, I think, is more in line with, I had a call with Jeff Francis last night because I wanted to try to figure out what the superintendents might think. He supports this kind of language because his thinking is that districts are going to be in a very financially shaky position. They're having to lay out monies that they weren't planning to lay out. And so his worry, and mine, I guess, are about districts that for reasons outside of their control, they can't get a budget approved. And so then they wind up in a situation where they have to incur borrowing costs, you know, interest costs over a long period of time because COVID-19 is preventing a vote on a budget. So this was really meant, the language we're looking at is meant more as a stopgap if people can't do something. If, Corey, we had to do what you're talking about, we would not withstand this language if we had already passed it,
Okay.
I would think. Ruth, you had a question as well.
Yeah, I share those same concerns that Corey has, and think that we are going to be in a position where school districts are maybe en masse going to have to revote budgets. I'll be interested to hear what Sue is finding out from talking to school boards, and what Jeff is finding out from talking to superintendents, and of course Brad and Emily at the AOE, and Jeff Fannin too. Yeah, why not? So I mean, I think that, you know, we don't have enough data yet right now to know what the situation is going to be, but I think our counterparts in the House got a report last Friday that basically the education fund is insolvent at this point. So I can't support putting in any kind of inflator for budgets for next year. I think we're really going to be in a position where school districts are going to have to really take a hard look at their budgets and potentially redo them. And I don't know if that's going to be because we require them to do it or because they just see the writing on the wall and they know they're going to have to do it. At this point, taxpayers are not going to be able to pay their property tax, or a lot of them aren't. So I think, but we don't really have full information yet. So I'm assuming that Brad is working on that, and JFO and others. But until we see more data, sort of big picture data, I don't think we should be passing any measures about school budgets. But I do think before we leave, we are going to have to put something in about school budgets, because our education fund is just not going to support that. I think it was a 4% average increase across the state, and there's no way that is going to be able to be supported by our education fund. So we're going to have to do something, but I don't think this is the answer. And I think it's too early to know what the answer might be.
And it's possible we could just do 100% of last year's budget without an inflator. That in effect is a cut to people's budgets, but it would at least give them what they had the previous year without having to borrow it. So why don't we go to the rest of our witnesses and get their thoughts on the table. Brad, from AOE's point of view?
There we go. Am I there for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in regards to the talk about having people borrow, is that's going to incur a cost on people. They're going to generate interest on pretty large sums of money, and there's no telling when a budget will be passed by the voters, because this is not a good economic situation. It is going downhill at the moment, and there's no telling how long it's going to be. to address what you were saying, Ruth, when I was talking to House Ways and Means and Education yet on Thursday, when I was talking to you guys in health and welfare, the hole in the ed fund was between 35 and $45 million. As of 5 o'clock on Thursday evening, after those conversations, it was more like $90 million. So it's a real problem. I think, though, that something is going to have to be done, whether it's done today or sometime soon. Something's going to have to be done because people are going to have to be getting money for this coming school year. Yeah, they still got 3 months before their bills start coming due, but I'm not seeing much of a change coming along. So I think what we at the agency, because I was talking to Secretary French earlier today, what we at the agency are supporting is this concept of using the FY20 numbers as a basis to what you're going to do to impose the wrong word. I'm not sure what the right word is, but to give these people budgets, the 18 districts that don't have budgets, to give them some stability so they know what's going on. They will not be incurring borrowing costs at that point. Whether or not there's an inflationary factor thrown in there, that's a political decision or decision for you guys to add in. It's probably partly political too. I think in a lot of cases though, it's necessary because I don't know as costs are going down for people. It's hard to say what's happening with all the school districts right now because it's not uniform across the districts. Most districts are incurring costs that they were not planning on incurring, so they're spending money they don't expect. But in some cases, they're also saving money that they thought they were going to be spending because they're not necessarily paying all the bills that they're going to, not necessarily paying all the transportation costs or the fuel costs, things like that. I haven't heard of anybody not paying staff. I think that everybody is paying staff as far as I know. My understanding is a fair number of districts are also honoring all their contracts, even though they're not receiving the services. There's question as to what services kids are getting when you're paying tuition, either in-state, out-of-state, special education, general education. But people are honoring their contracts. So the costs are probably going to build up as time goes. How much it's going to be, I don't know. This is kind of a long way of getting around to your question, your comment about the inflationary factor, Ruth. It's hard to say right now. You're right. It is hard to say right now what's going to happen, what's going to be going. I think though that I would say that if you were to use the FY, this is off the top of my head because I've not looked at numbers, but if you were to use the FY20 budgets that failed in those 9 districts as the base and not be an inflator, that would be probably across the board less than what failed in their districts that they thought they needed. Generally speaking, from what I've seen, when budgets fail, when they eventually pass, they come in, fairly close to what they failed, the level at which they failed, not significantly lower. So I think that they've made decisions what they need to do. Can they cut back at this point? Probably, because they haven't gone back out the revote, but I know that a number of them are anxious to get those votes in. I think if you were to say to these people, plus the ones who have not yet voted, that we are working on giving you a budget, that would go a long way towards alleviating some of the fear that some of these people are having.
Okay, so Brad, just to draw out what you said a little bit, so you and the secretary then would support previous year's budget as the default that is not borrowed, but that becomes the district's allowable spending. And then you're saying that the question of an inflator is more for the legislature.
I think so. Yes. I know Secretary French and I were talking about it because any borrowing is going to incur extra costs.
Yep.
So it makes more sense to have as a starting point of last year or this current year's budget.
Yep. Okay, so it sounds like, Corey, am I representing your thoughts accurately to say that you might be able to support last year's budget without the inflator?
I'd be more likely there. I think we have to have a broader conversation here, but I think, yeah, for this small piece, that I would be much more comfortable with that than with an inflator.
Yep. And to Ruth's point, I think it's part of a larger discussion that we will be having with finance. We'll be having a joint meeting with finance probably next week to talk about this issue. It may be that there's a global remedy we need that takes care of this problem of default budgets, and we won't have to worry about it. If it doesn't, it's looking as though maybe the language we have minus the inflator could work. Sue, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I just have some information for you about the districts that are affected, if that's helpful. There were 106 school district budgets that have been voted on to date, and 97 were approved. There were 9 that were defeated, and there are 9 that have not yet voted on their budgets. So we're talking about, as far as the ones that do not have an approved budget right now, there are 18 altogether. As you mentioned, Senator Bruce, there were some temporary elections provisions that were put in place last week. Governor Scott signed H681, and so that has provisions in it granting the Secretary of State authority with the governor's agreement to permit appropriate procedures for voting on things like school budgets. Some of the procedures that were put in the law include mail balloting, requiring town clerks to send ballots by mail to all the registered voters, and ballot collection stations, and a number of other provisions that would allow elections to occur with these temporary provisions. And there was elections guidance that was issued last week by the Secretary of State, as you noted, that is recommending that no elections occur in April and May. The stated objective of that from the Secretary of State's office is to see if votes can be conducted safely in late spring or early summer, and if that's not possible, to provide time for them to implement some appropriate procedures so that elections could take place safely. So we've communicated all of that guidance to school boards. The VSBA board, as I mentioned, is meeting tomorrow night, and I'm certainly going to be bringing all of this to their attention so that I can get an official position from them. Some of the concerns that we've had from school boards that don't have budgets yet have to do with the timing of their budget votes. And I did communicate today with the Secretary of State's office to confirm that their initial budget warning has a requirement of not less than 30 days and not more than 40 days. But if they're voting, if their budget was defeated and they're voting a second time, the requirement, as long as they're voting by Australian ballot, is a 7-day minimum warning. It can be longer than that to allow for absentee balloting, but it's a 7-day minimum. So I wanted to give you that background information to let you know what they're working with current law and the temporary changes that were put in place last week. And you already have the information that they have the ability to borrow up to 87% of the previous year's budget, and that's not a default budget. It's just an ability to borrow. So we are definitely communicating the severity of the situation to school boards and preparing them for the work that they have ahead of them. I think it's important to stabilize the current situation, and I believe that everyone will be able to work together to address the situation. There are also implications for collective bargaining that probably Jeff Fannin, excuse me, may go into when he speaks after me. But it's definitely going to be difficult to address reducing budgets after the fact. That's collective bargaining is a complicated factor in that. Oh, I can't hear you.
If I could just ask you, the question, the $64,000 question, would school boards generally be in favor of default language that replaces the current statutory language about borrowing with the previous year's budget?
I think that I would actually need to check with affected boards and see how they feel about that language. It does seem to add a measure of protection for them in this very unstable economic situation.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'm
Questions?
happy to check in with them.
Okay. Questions for Sue Siglowski before we go to Jeff? Okay. Oh, Ruth?
Sue, I'm wondering if you have you been talking to school boards just sort of generally about how they're feeling about their FY21 budgets and whether they feel like they're going to have to revisit those, or what are you hearing in terms of the longer term, bigger picture, more than just from these 18 districts, or are you not yet?
We have sent out a survey to school board members, and we're just getting the results back from them. I think I think the whole picture, as you said earlier, we probably don't even know the whole picture yet, and that can be problematic. You know, earlier in the week, last week, we were thinking that it was a certain amount that the ed fund was affected, and then basically overnight it became double what we thought it was. So it's definitely a fluid situation, and so whatever information I get back from them is just based on what they knew at the time that they responded. And since then, something else may have changed, but we are trying to gather the information as best that we can.
Okay, thanks. I'll look forward to hearing what you gather.
Thank you. Let's go to Jeff. Jeff, your thoughts?
Yes, thanks for giving me a few minutes here. So we too are concerned about the fiscal health of the school system, but also now, you know, in the short term as well as the long term. So we do believe that school budgets need to be adopted, and however you decide to do that, I think school communities need to have stability to ensure that education is delivered to students. These are truly extraordinary times and call for extraordinary solutions, though. We think they ought to be a one-time solution. You know, there was some discussion earlier about the yield. I've heard it in other committees, discussion of the yield. And we always have that same discussion. The yield, in fact, in 2018 wasn't even issued until July 1st, I think it was. That was the special session. So the yield discussion is not entirely new, but it's entirely new in the context of a pandemic. We are beginning to see, and we think it's going to ever increase, as I alluded to earlier, student needs are increasing, and they are not decreasing. And I think we have to acknowledge that here. For example, statewide testing, as I mentioned, and we also think mental health issues next year will be significant. For example, we typically think that in many cases, kids who are at most at risk, the safest place for them to be is in the school. And instead, we've sent them home in many cases to the most unsafe environment, unfortunately. So we think that there will be significant need for mental health and counselors next year to make up for this, the concerns that we're sending these kids home to and into unsafe places. Additionally, before the corona pandemic, we were concerned about teacher shortages, and we think it's going to get worse. Under Act 173, for example, using that as a backdrop, one of the things we talked about some 2 years ago was there were not enough special ed teachers in the state then, and we wondered where we're going to come up with more that were required for Act 173. What I'm seeing and hearing about are more and more educators are stressed. And so I think we need to do something in this case to take something off their list of stressors and removing the financial stressor that school systems generally might have. So I applaud that. And finally, Oregon and Washington use vote by mail, and maybe that's an option here at some level. The GovOp committees have been talking about this for some time. It's often considered the gold standard for voter involvement. So maybe that's an option or something to discuss. And maybe that's for the GovOps committee to take up. But we do support some financial stability for schools in the form of not requiring them to borrow, add to their debt when they're already under financial stress, as we know, but also giving them the tool to have a budget come September 1 when they're back in school. And we think the solution you've crafted in the language, and I don't want to toggle back to another screen, is probably the right way to go. So we do support that language that's on your website.
Okay, committee, questions for Jeff? Okay, thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.
So I believe we've heard from everybody. Are there any of the witnesses who would like to speak to the issue again before I have some time for committee discussion? Jim? Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, sorry. So just one thing, which is really a policy question. The language drafted, the question I think that kind of lies within it is whether if you pass that, you want to make it mandatory that school districts that haven't passed budgets have a default budget, or you want to make it not mandatory, but have an option for the school board to either take the default budget, borrow the money, or go out for a revote or vote after July 1. So the question is whether we want to make it mandatory or not mandatory. And I'm thinking there might be an issue of fairness or perceived fairness in there of school districts that haven't voted yet are forced to take the language as opposed to having the option. So just something more to consider as you talk about this.
Yeah, I guess speaking for myself, I tend to like fewer complications in a situation like this. So having some districts do one thing, some districts do another, I think it adds to confusion. The other thing is, I think it's probably best if we frame this within the emergency itself. In other words, for the coming year's budget, rather than change statute going forward. So we would be looking at essentially a one-time mandatory default of last year's budget. If you didn't come up with your own by July 1st, then it would revert next year to what we have in statute. And the committee could take up next year, do we want to change that permanently when we can have the full run of witnesses and stakeholder input, et cetera. But a fair question for the committee, if other people like the idea of having a default budget be an option or retaining the power to borrow. I just don't know why a district would borrow if they didn't have to, but any questions for any of the witnesses? If not, we'll transition just to committee discussion. Witnesses, thank very much. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. Feel free to stay with us if you want to. But if you go ahead, Ruth.
Sorry, I was just hoping that Brad, if you at some point in all of your spare time, any information about these 18 districts that the 9 that have not yet voted and versus the 9 that have had their budgets failed, what percentage increase failed? You know, do you know what I mean? Is that possible? Or Sue, maybe you have this information?
For the 9?
For the 9 that failed or the 9 that hadn't yet voted a budget, wouldn't they have, most of them might have had a budget already in the works?
When, I'm going to jump in first, Sue, if you don't mind. When I collect data at the beginning of the basically legislative session, it's the preliminary budget data. It's a voluntary collection, but most people submit data. I know that several months ago I did look to see who had failed and who had submitted data. I think most everybody had submitted data. I think of the 9 who have not voted yet, I think it's roughly half have maybe given me an idea what they're. I can certainly reach out to them and find out, and I can pull information together fairly quickly once I hear from them about what they did for FY20 versus what they were or are proposing for FY21, and send you that information.
Okay, it would just be helpful to know, like, what is the difference between what they would have done or hope to have done versus
Okay.
this option.
Okay.
Okay, so committee, I'm wondering, let's open it up to discussion of both topics, Act 173 delay and the possibility of changing language to create a default for the coming year. Let me just start by saying, it seems to me that Act 173 delay with the Secretary's agreement on that, it seems likely to me that all the stakeholders are going to line up behind it. Is there anybody on the committee who has objections or concerns about another 1-year delay? Or potentially somebody who goes along with Jeff's idea of a longer delay? Thoughts on that from anybody?
I think a 1-year delay makes sense. And like you said, we could come back to it next year if we want to talk further delay, but in the spirit of what we're doing surrounding COVID, 1 year makes the most sense to me.
Okay. Let's do it by just raising your hand and then yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
Thanks. Well, I mean, just sort of playing devil's advocate, I had originally had a thought that maybe going ahead with it would provide the flexibility and funding that some of the schools need, with the kids at home and, and things not working the way that they have worked. But I mean, I guess, the argument about actually changing the culture, though, of the teaching and that sort of thing, kind of doesn't, it would be very difficult to do that with the kids at home and learning remotely. But anyway, but yeah, so I would support just a 1-year delay. I think, we should take it in small bites and keep looking at what needs to be done later. Because nobody really knows what's going to happen and when it's going to happen with this virus.
Jim, did I see your hand up? No, you're muted, Jim.
I'm in favor with a 1-year delay just because of the COVID-19 that has come up here on all of us very fast. I was hoping to be able to get some money out for special ed and for English learning students sooner than later, but 1-year delay makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Don't see any other hands. So is it fair to represent the position of the committee at this point without any other intervening data from State Board or the special ed panel, that we are in support of a 1-year delay? So I will communicate that to Representative Webb, and we'll look at language to do that. We won't pull the trigger on it until I have a chance and the Secretary has a chance to get together with the panel and the State Board just to make sure they don't have any unexpected opposition. So this wouldn't be for the short-term votes in the Senate, the first remote vote, but maybe the second round of remote voting. Okay, then let's go to the language on budgets. So let me suggest we think about it like this. back to Ruth's point about the global situation, I think that it may be that House and Senate money committees and ed committees get behind the idea of some universal fix to budgets, whether it's holding them flat, cutting them, adding to them. I won't prejudice that discussion, but it may be that there's a unified response to the coming year's budget. If there's not, then I think we should be thinking seriously about passing default language in the event that a district or 9 districts or 18 districts or however many can't come up with a budget. If that is necessary, it seems as though there is not support on the committee for an inflator. It also seems as though there is support for 100% of the previous year's budget as a default rather than a borrowing capacity. Is that fair to say, and does that reflect your own personal thinking? Just raise your hand if you want to address that. Andrew, go ahead. Then Jim, then Debbie.
I don't understand the difference, I guess, between the budget and the authority to borrow. If somebody could explain what the difference is there.
Yeah, I mean, if you, under current language, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, you hit July 1st and then you no longer have borrowing authority. I'm sorry, no longer have spending authority unless you do something to get funds to expend. And so you'd have to borrow from some lending institution, pay the going rate, and you'd only be able to borrow 87% of your previous year's total. Is that fair, Jim?
So
okay.
Is anybody suggesting that that's a better way of going than doing the budget? So you would allow them to borrow but not have a budget?
No, so the suggestion is that we change the language so that their default instead becomes just having, it would be as though they had passed a budget that was last year's budget. No borrowing, that would just be their approved spending from the state.
Because right now the statute says they only get the approved borrowing authority. And we would say they don't have to hold a vote. They get whatever their budget was last year.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm in support of that. I would even be okay with an inflationary increase, just because costs are going to go up that little about a little bit. But I also understand people's argument that because of the huge downfalls in the education fund, we should be as careful as possible.
Yeah, and I think to go back to the dynamics, the physics of how you pass something in the moment we're in, you've all seen it in your other committees and in the all Senate calls with Tim. You know, there's a general desire not to do anything that doesn't have the broadest level of agreement. So it's pretty clear from our discussion that if we had an inflator, that would divide senators, divide House members. So far, nobody's really proposed an argument against using last year's budget, including AOE and the superintendents. So other thoughts from anybody? Oh, Debbie, you, or Jim, you were next, I think. Want me to come back to you, Jim? Let's go to Debbie. You lost your place.
Lost your turn. Oh no. Jump back in anytime you unmute. Yes, so I support having them allowing the districts to level, basically it's level fund their budgets, right? So but I don't know if we want to do something about it. So what's in place now is that a school district that had an approved budget could have a second vote if the school board orders it, basically, right? Yeah. So I worry that that will lead to chaos. Although I'm sympathetic to what Senator Parent and Senator Hardy brought up about, people's ability to pay may be decreased, so school boards might want to lower their budget. But I'm kind of wonder if we shouldn't do something about that as well, because I just worry that we're just going to add more chaos to the system if we don't sort of have some
Yeah.
amounts that we've locked in.
And as I say, it may turn out, once we put our heads together with the money committees and House leadership and Senate leadership, it may turn out that there's agreement on a global solution. Failing that, I think a way to think about it is districts now have the tools they need with the Australian ballot change and the normal statutory allowance that they could go back with another vote. Take those two things together. Local districts have a lot of flexibility in how they're going to go forward. But we would be saying, here's a safety net for districts. Like, for instance, let's say you haven't been able to vote on a budget. You want to follow the Secretary of State's advice and not vote in April or May. That leaves you June. God forbid, but what if we have another spike in cases and no one's going to go vote in June? Then we would have a provision passed to protect districts that couldn't vote. So whatever else happens, I'm just thinking of this as a piece of language that we could pass, and then if need be, not withstand later in favor of a broader solution.
Yeah.
Jim?
Yes, I think it's a great fallback for the school boards to know that they have the budget that they could use. And I'm in favor of the current budget. Without the 80% of borrowing power, they might need the 100%. And without the inflationary rate in there, I don't think anybody needs that right now. So I think it'd be great for the school boards to know that they got to go and not to spend any more waste any more money on working up a budget unless they really want to go to vote. It's going to get more and more expensive as we go closer and closer to July 1st.
Okay, Ruth.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm fine with the language as long as we don't have the inflator in it. I feel like at this point, knowing what we know, we want to be as conservative as possible. Another factor that hasn't been mentioned yet that we don't know how it all will play out is the federal money that's coming in. There's actually a fairly big chunk for education, and that hopefully will take care of some of the excess costs that districts have seen this year, and may help in FY21 as well. So I'm hoping that we're able to, at some point before we adjourn, have a more global fix, or at least plan for all of this. And this language may not be necessary, but for now, I think it makes sense to have this moving forward. And I just also want to remind everybody, this is only 18 school districts that we're talking about. The vast majority of school districts already have their budgets passed. And they may be thinking about how they need to reevaluate those budgets, but I don't think they're all going to run out and try to revote a budget in this crisis. So I think that the soonest that a school district would think about revoting a budget is end of the summer, beginning of the fall. And that may be just because they're hearing so much from their local voters that they can't afford the budget that's already passed. So I'm not too worried about the chaos of people trying to go pass renew new budgets during this. It's just trying to help these 18 districts. And I think the non-inflator solution is fine.
Okay. Okay, so Jim, if you wouldn't mind, if you could draft us up 173 delay language for a year's delay. And I'm a little confused on whether the House is going to send the technical corrections with the delay language, but if you have that language from them anyway, maybe you could just stick it in our draft so that we could look at that all together.
Yeah, no, it's in there already. So technical language goes with the date changes, yeah.
Okay, and then if you could revise the language on the default according to our discussion so that it's for the coming year only and it's minus the inflator.
Okay,
And then there are the references to articles of agreement. Since this isn't Act 46 related now, do we need that?
it's just having them act in accordance with, in terms of how they spend the money.
But aren't there districts who don't have articles of agreement?
I
I mean, in other words, they were merged before. In any event, just
I
take a
think
look at,
all districts have articles of agreement, but I can take out the reference because they're going to have to follow them anyway, so.
yeah. Okay, and then if you can, when you're done with that, send it to me, send it to Jeannie to post,
Okay,
and then she'll alert the committee that it's there and people can run their eye over it. What kind of timeline do you think on that, Jim?
no, it can be in by tomorrow.
Okay, we are meeting Thursday at 2. I'm still working on the agenda, but we'll put both of those drafts on there
Okay,
and you can walk us through them.
sure, yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Committee, anything else? Debbie?
Yeah, I was wondering if we could get some more information from AOE about what kind of federal money they expect to be receiving. Has anybody done an analysis of that? That'd be nice to Brad. Yes,
I believe that would be Brad Page.
I should have guessed. So maybe he could
Brad?
share with us what.
Button there. I need to push the right button. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It just said I was being muted. I know. So to answer your question, no, we have not run numbers yet because we do not know how much money we're getting yet from the federal government. Those numbers are not finalized. What we do know is that it will be allocated out based on the Title I allocations. The number is in the ballpark of 31 million. If we keep 10% like we're talking about doing to use for what the secretary thinks is allowed and necessary, that leaves the districts roughly 28%. So what we've kind of told districts as a ballpark figure is that if they figure out what their Title I money is that they got this year, figure roughly 80% of that is probably about what they'll get. So that's kind of a ballpark figure for them.
Okay. And if I could ask Brad, when data like that becomes available and you're putting it together in a form to pass around, if you could send it to Jeannie to distribute to the committee, that would
Sure.
be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know when that will be because there's no information yet from the federal folks as to when the monies are actually going to be released. So we're still in that process of having to apply and having them say yes, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
but as soon as we can, we will.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
And I did hear that there will probably be some money available for colleges and universities and stuff too.
I didn't really read that section of the CARES Act, but there is money in there for higher education.
Yeah.
And
So
I believe the emergency money the governor will get, which is, I want to say around a little over 4 million, but I'm not certain of that number, is also, I think he can also use that for what he sees fit, including higher education.
yes, I did. I heard that. Yeah. Yeah. That's it's like 60. It's like 2/3 of it is for pre-K through 12, and then
Yeah, I've been
Just for-
focusing on that part.
yeah, and then the governor gets to decide what the rest is. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, folks. I think we're done with our work for today. As I say, the agenda for Thursday is still shaping up, but we will meet at 2. We will reconsider these 2 drafts. And then there are a couple of other things that I'm kicking around and making phone calls on. But also I wanted to just encourage you, if anybody believes they have some thing in need of a statutory fix that they want the committee to be working on, please email me directly and we'll chat about it and then put it on the agenda. Okay, have a great day, folks. See you soon.